If the system is wrong for even 1 second, justice becomes a weapon instead of a truth. The words were not spoken by any of the officers on the scene, but they seemed to echo through the cold morning air of downtown Chicago as if the city itself was quietly observing what was about to unfold. At the center of a narrow industrial street near a fenced perimeter lot, 3 uniformed officers stood in a controlled formation around a single woman whose presence did not match the assumptions being made about her. The metal fence behind her cast long vertical shadows across the pavement, cutting the scene into segments of light and tension, while the early morning wind moved lightly through the corridor of buildings, carrying distant sounds of traffic and machinery that continued to operate as if nothing unusual was happening. Officer Ryan Blake stood closest, maintaining procedural authority with a firm stance and focused expression, his attention locked on the situation as he interpreted it through incomplete information. Behind him, Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter held positions that reinforced the containment perimeter, their movements precise, their posture disciplined, their understanding shaped by the same fragmented report that had brought them here. In the center of their attention stood Judge Madison Cole, a black federal judge whose identity was not yet recognized in the moment, her hands restrained against the metal fence with standard procedure cuffs that had been applied during what was believed to be a lawful detainment. Her expression remained steady, not resistant, not pleading, but controlled in a way that did not align with the narrative forming around her. There was no visible panic, no escalation in her demeanor, only a calm awareness that seemed to exist independently of the situation being constructed around her. The environment itself felt unusually still, as if the normal rhythm of the city had been temporarily narrowed down to this single point of procedural focus. A passing vehicle slowed at the end of the block, not stopping, but observing briefly before continuing on, while a distant pedestrian paused at the corner, uncertain whether what they were seeing was routine enforcement or something more significant. Officer Blake spoke briefly into his radio, confirming details of the warrant status as it had been provided to him, though the information he was relying on had not yet been fully cross-verified at the federal level. The tone of his voice remained controlled, professional, but carried the subtle confidence of someone acting under the assumption that procedure was already on his side. Judge Cole remained silent, her gaze forward, not directed at any single officer, but oriented toward the space beyond them, as if she was observing the system rather than reacting to it. The fence behind her, cold and unyielding, became a symbolic divider between perception and truth, while the officers continued operating within the framework of what they believed to be confirmed authority. No one had yet spoken the name that would change the structure of the entire encounter, and in that gap between assumption and verification, the situation remained suspended in a fragile state of procedural certainty that had not yet been tested against institutional reality. The cold air between the fence and the officers began to feel heavier as the situation remained locked in a controlled but unresolved state, where every movement carried procedural meaning and every pause extended the weight of uncertainty. Officer Ryan Blake maintained his position at the front, his attention still directed toward Judge Madison Cole, though his focus now carried a subtle layer of procedural hesitation as the radio communication continued to process incomplete verification data. Behind him, Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter held their spacing along the perimeter, maintaining standard containment formation, their posture steady and professional as they waited for confirmation that would either validate or adjust the current enforcement action. The metal fence behind Judge Cole remained a rigid visual anchor in the scene, separating her from the officers in both physical structure and symbolic interpretation, reinforcing the sense that the situation was being defined more by assumption than by confirmed identity. Judge Cole remained completely still, her restraint unchanged, her expression calm and controlled, showing no visible reaction to the procedural uncertainty surrounding her status. Her presence did not shift or escalate, but instead maintained a quiet consistency that contrasted with the growing reliance on external verification processes unfolding through the radio channel. Officer Blake adjusted his stance slightly, shifting weight between his feet as he listened to updates from dispatch, where the warrant information was being cross-checked against federal records. The communication introduced a subtle delay into the situation, a procedural gap that began to widen the space between assumed authority and verified jurisdiction. The surrounding environment remained active at a distance, with occasional movement from passing vehicles and pedestrians who observed briefly before continuing onward, reinforcing the sense that this moment existed temporarily outside normal urban flow. Officer Mills glanced toward Blake, awaiting instruction, while Officer Carter maintained visual coverage of the perimeter, both operating within established protocol but aware that the situation was no longer progressing with immediate certainty. Judge Cole's posture remained unchanged, her calm presence continuing to anchor the center of the scene without resistance or escalation, as if she was waiting for the system itself to complete its evaluation. The radio emitted a brief burst of static followed by partial confirmation updates, indicating that identity verification was still in progress and that federal coordination had been initiated to clarify jurisdictional status. This development subtly altered the atmosphere, introducing a shift from procedural confidence toward conditional reassessment. Officer Blake did not react outwardly, but his attention sharpened, reflecting the transition from assumption-based enforcement to system-dependent validation. The fence, the officers, and the restrained figure remained locked in a static composition, but the meaning of the moment was beginning to shift beneath the surface of procedural language and delayed confirmation. No one moved decisively. Yet the structure of authority within the scene had begun to loosen slightly, awaiting the final determination that would define the direction of the encounter. The procedural tension at the fence line deepened as the radio transmission continued cycling through layers of verification, shifting the encounter further away from immediate enforcement certainty and deeper into institutional dependency. Officer Ryan Blake remained in the lead position, but his posture now reflected a subtle recalibration, as the confidence derived from the initial warrant briefing was being gradually replaced by conditional uncertainty introduced through federal cross-checking systems. Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter maintained their positions along the perimeter, their focus steady and disciplined, yet increasingly attentive to the evolving status updates coming through the radio channel. Judge Madison Cole remained completely still against the metal fence, her restraint unchanged, her expression composed and unreadable, maintaining a calm presence that contrasted with the procedural instability developing around her classification. The surrounding environment remained visually consistent, with the industrial street extending into muted urban distance, occasional movement from passing vehicles, and distant pedestrians continuing their routines without fully engaging with the scene unfolding at the fenced perimeter. Officer Blake received another update through the radio, this time indicating that federal judicial records were being accessed to confirm identity alignment with the issued warrant documentation. This introduced a critical procedural shift, as the verification process expanded beyond standard warrant confirmation into higher-level institutional cross-referencing. The tone of the communication remained controlled, but the implications of the update subtly altered the authority structure within the scene. Officer Blake did not immediately respond verbally, instead maintaining focus on the subject in front of him while processing the significance of delayed federal confirmation. Officer Mills adjusted his stance slightly, indicating awareness that the situation was no longer purely local enforcement in nature, while Officer Carter continued perimeter observation with heightened attention to environmental movement and procedural stability. Judge Cole's posture remained unchanged, her calm demeanor uninterrupted by the shifting dynamics of authority and verification, reinforcing a presence that existed independently of the evolving assumptions surrounding her status. The fence continued to function as a rigid boundary between perception and verified identity, its metal structure visually reinforcing the separation between immediate interpretation and institutional truth. The radio emitted another structured update, confirming that identity matching was in progress with federal judicial databases, and that temporary procedural hold was recommended until final verification was complete. This directive introduced a noticeable change in operational tempo, slowing the momentum of enforcement action and replacing it with procedural pause. Officer Blake maintained visual contact with Judge Cole, but his attention now included a layered awareness of jurisdictional uncertainty that had not been present at the beginning of the encounter. The surrounding street remained calm at a distance, with ambient city movement continuing unaffected, emphasizing the isolation of the procedural event within the broader urban environment. No physical escalation occurred, but the structural authority within the scene continued to shift toward institutional systems beyond the immediate control of the officers present. The situation now existed in a suspended state of verification, awaiting final confirmation that would determine whether the initial interpretation of authority would be upheld or reversed entirely. The procedural suspension at the fenced perimeter continued to evolve as the verification process moved into its final institutional phase, where authority was no longer determined by field interpretation but by confirmed alignment within federal judicial databases. Officer Ryan Blake remained positioned closest to Judge Madison Cole, his posture steady but increasingly reflective of the shifting weight of responsibility as the radio continued to deliver delayed but progressively definitive updates. Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter maintained their perimeter positions, their attention now divided between environmental awareness and the procedural implications unfolding through each new transmission. Judge Cole remained restrained against the metal fence, her expression unchanged, her calm presence continuing to serve as a fixed point within a rapidly reconfiguring authority structure. The early morning light had now strengthened further, illuminating the industrial surroundings with greater clarity, revealing textured concrete surfaces, chain-link shadows, and distant urban movement that continued independently of the localized procedural event. Another radio transmission arrived, this time carrying a higher level of federal confirmation priority, indicating that judicial identity matching was nearing completion and that temporary enforcement status should remain unchanged until final authorization was issued. This update introduced a critical procedural inflection, as the situation transitioned from active field enforcement into a verification-dependent hold state. Officer Blake did not adjust his stance immediately, but his focus subtly shifted as he processed the implications of federal judicial involvement, recognizing that the scope of verification now extended beyond standard warrant validation into direct identity confirmation at the institutional level. Officer Mills exchanged a brief glance with Officer Carter, both maintaining professional discipline while acknowledging through silence that the procedural direction of the encounter was no longer under local control. Judge Cole remained steady, her composure uninterrupted, her presence now increasingly aligned with the emerging verification narrative that was overriding the initial field assumptions. The fence behind her continued to act as a visual boundary, reinforcing the contrast between perceived enforcement authority and evolving institutional clarity. The radio emitted a longer, more structured transmission indicating that federal judicial records had returned a potential positive match and that immediate procedural reassessment was required before any further enforcement continuation. This message significantly altered the operational tone of the scene, introducing a controlled pause in all active enforcement considerations. Officer Blake maintained visual focus, but his posture reflected a subtle shift from assertion to evaluation, as the foundation of the initial warrant interpretation was now being recontextualized by federal confirmation protocols. The surrounding environment remained stable, with distant traffic continuing its routine flow and occasional pedestrians observing from afar without intervening or approaching the fence perimeter. No physical changes occurred within the scene, but the internal structure of authority had begun to reassign itself through procedural confirmation channels rather than field-level assumption. The situation now existed in a fully transitional verification state, awaiting final institutional determination that would define the outcome of all preceding actions. The fence perimeter scene entered its final phase of procedural transformation as the federal verification process reached a near-complete state of confirmation, shifting the entire structure of authority from field-level enforcement into institutional validation dependency. Officer Ryan Blake remained at the front position, but his posture now reflected a fully restrained operational stance, as each new radio transmission reduced the certainty of the initial warrant interpretation and replaced it with layered federal confirmation logic. Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter continued maintaining perimeter control, their presence now functioning less as active enforcement and more as procedural containment support while awaiting final jurisdictional resolution. Judge Madison Cole remained in the same restrained position against the metal fence, her composure unchanged, her expression steady and controlled, reinforcing a calm presence that contrasted with the increasingly complex verification process unfolding around her identity. The early morning light had now fully expanded across the industrial street, revealing sharper environmental detail, including textured metal surfaces, long chain-link shadows, and distant city movement continuing without interruption, emphasizing how isolated the procedural event remained within the broader urban system. A new federal transmission arrived, this time carrying elevated confirmation priority, indicating that judicial identity verification had produced a high-confidence match and that final authorization review was now underway at federal coordination level. This update introduced a decisive procedural shift as the situation moved from active verification into pre-resolution state, where enforcement authority was effectively paused pending final institutional approval. Officer Blake did not move, but his attention narrowed significantly, reflecting full recognition that the initial assumption guiding the operation was no longer the primary governing factor in the situation. Officer Mills subtly adjusted his stance, while Officer Carter maintained continuous observation, both officers now fully aware that jurisdictional control was transitioning beyond their operational authority. Judge Cole remained composed and silent, her presence unchanged, her restraint no longer defining her status but instead existing as a temporary procedural artifact awaiting correction. The fence continued to serve as a physical boundary, but its symbolic meaning had shifted from containment to misalignment between perception and verified authority. The radio delivered a final pre-resolution advisory, indicating that federal judicial confirmation was imminent and that all local enforcement action should remain suspended until official clearance was issued. This message stabilized the scene into a fully controlled procedural hold state, eliminating any remaining ambiguity in operational direction. Officer Blake maintained visual focus but no longer exhibited interpretive certainty, as the procedural structure around him had fully transitioned into federal validation dependency. The surrounding environment remained unchanged, with ambient city activity continuing at a distance, reinforcing the contrast between normal urban flow and the isolated procedural event at the fence perimeter. No physical movement occurred, but the authority structure within the scene had fully inverted in function, now awaiting final confirmation that would determine the complete outcome of all preceding enforcement actions. The fenced perimeter scene reached its final procedural resolution phase as the federal verification process completed its last cycle of institutional confirmation, transitioning the entire situation from active enforcement suspension into definitive jurisdictional clarification. Officer Ryan Blake remained at the front position, his posture now fully stabilized in a neutral operational stance, reflecting the complete shift from initial warrant-based assumption to federal authority confirmation dependency. Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter held their perimeter positions with disciplined stillness, their roles now reduced to observational support as the procedural outcome became entirely determined by external federal verification systems rather than local enforcement judgment. Judge Madison Cole remained restrained against the metal fence, her expression unchanged and composed, her calm presence now fully recontextualized as the central verified identity within the scene rather than the subject of suspicion. The early morning light had fully expanded across the industrial corridor, illuminating every structural detail of the environment, including the metal fence lines, concrete textures, and distant urban motion that continued without interruption, reinforcing the contrast between normal city continuity and the isolated procedural event that had now reached completion. A final federal transmission arrived through the radio channel, carrying definitive judicial identity confirmation and official authorization alignment, marking the end of all verification ambiguity and formally resolving jurisdictional uncertainty. This transmission triggered an immediate procedural transition from hold state to resolution state, instructing all local enforcement units to terminate active enforcement posture and acknowledge corrected identity classification. Officer Blake did not react physically, but his attention shifted into complete acknowledgement mode, reflecting the full institutional override of initial warrant interpretation by federal judicial confirmation. Officers Mills and Carter maintained their positions momentarily, processing the final update as standard protocol required confirmation acknowledgement before disengagement. Judge Cole remained still for a brief moment longer, her restraint still physically present but now procedurally invalidated, as the system had fully recognized her identity within federal judicial authority records. The fence, which had served as a physical and symbolic boundary throughout the encounter, now functioned only as a static environmental structure with no remaining procedural significance. The radio emitted a final closure directive, confirming that all enforcement actions were to be officially logged as resolved due to misidentification correction and federal override confirmation. This message established complete procedural closure, eliminating any remaining ambiguity in jurisdiction, authority, or operational status. Officer Blake maintained visual presence for a final moment before transitioning into standard disengagement protocol, while Officers Mills and Carter followed procedural deactivation steps in coordination. Judge Cole was released from restraint as the final instruction was acknowledged, her posture remaining calm and steady as she regained full mobility within the now normalized environment. The surrounding city continued its uninterrupted movement, with traffic and pedestrian activity unaffected by the resolved event, reinforcing the isolation of the procedural incident within broader urban continuity. The entire encounter now existed only as a completed institutional record of identity misinterpretation corrected through federal judicial confirmation, fully closed and removed from active operational status. The procedural encounter at the fence perimeter had fully transitioned into final closure state, where all enforcement actions were officially terminated and replaced by completed institutional correction records within federal judicial systems. The environment, once defined by controlled tension and structured uncertainty, now existed as a normalized urban space, where only residual awareness of the resolved event remained within the minds of the involved officers. Officer Ryan Blake stood momentarily in place after the release protocol had been completed, his posture now fully neutralized from enforcement readiness into standard operational stance, reflecting the final acknowledgement of jurisdictional correction issued by federal authority override. Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter completed their procedural disengagement steps, stepping back from the perimeter line and transitioning into standard duty posture as required by protocol following verified identity correction. Judge Madison Cole remained at the center of the former containment area for a brief moment, no longer restrained, her posture calm and composed as she fully re-established her presence within the physical space without procedural limitation or external control. The metal fence behind her, which had functioned as a boundary of misinterpretation throughout the encounter, now held no operational meaning, existing only as part of the static urban infrastructure of the environment. The early morning light had fully stabilized across the industrial street, revealing clear visibility across surrounding buildings, sidewalks, and distant traffic movement that continued uninterrupted by the resolved procedural event. A final administrative transmission confirmed closure status across all participating units, indicating that the incident had been logged as a completed federal judicial identity verification correction, with all enforcement misclassification formally resolved and archived. Officer Blake acknowledged the closure through standard procedural confirmation, maintaining professional composure as the operational shift transitioned from active incident management into routine patrol continuation. Officers Mills and Carter completed their acknowledgement sequence, returning attention to standard field responsibilities as directed by post-incident protocol. Judge Cole took a slow, controlled step forward, fully disengaged from the earlier restraint context, her expression unchanged and steady as she moved back into the natural flow of the city. Environment. No further interaction occurred between the involved parties, as the procedural structure that had governed the encounter no longer existed in active form. The surrounding city continued its normal rhythm without interruption, with vehicles moving through nearby intersections and pedestrians continuing their routines without awareness of the completed federal correction event. The scene that had briefly defined jurisdictional uncertainty and authority misalignment now existed only as a closed institutional record, fully resolved, fully corrected, and fully removed from active operational conditions within the enforcement system. The city had fully returned to its uninterrupted operational baseline following the complete resolution of the federal judicial identity verification incident, with all enforcement systems closed, all procedural flags cleared, and all participating units returned to standard duty assignment within their respective operational sectors. Officer Ryan Blake and Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter continued along their designated patrol route several blocks away from the fence perimeter, now fully reintegrated into routine field operations with no remaining active connection to the resolved case. Their movement through the urban grid reflected standard post-incident normalization, where attention returned to general public safety duties and environmental awareness replaced procedural focus. The radio system remained quiet regarding the previous event, indicating that all documentation had been finalized, archived, and locked within federal and departmental records as a completed jurisdictional correction. Officer Blake maintained a steady forward posture, his expression neutral and professional, reflecting the return to baseline operational mindset following the confirmation of identity misclassification and federal override resolution. Officers Mills and Carter followed in coordinated spacing, maintaining standard patrol discipline as they proceeded through the city streets that now carried no residual procedural significance from the earlier encounter. Across the city, Judge Madison Cole continued her independent movement through downtown districts, fully disengaged from any remaining procedural context, her presence now indistinguishable from normal pedestrian flow and no longer associated with enforcement or verification activity. Her posture remained composed and steady as she moved through the urban environment, reflecting complete restoration of her unimpeded status following formal federal judicial confirmation. The morning light had now fully stabilized across the cityscape, illuminating buildings, intersections, and sidewalks with consistent clarity, reinforcing the sense that the earlier incident existed only as a completed institutional event without ongoing physical presence. Traffic patterns continued in normal cycles, pedestrians moved through crosswalks without interruption, and the city maintained its standard rhythm of daily function without awareness of the resolved federal verification sequence that had briefly disrupted procedural operations at a single location. Officer Blake briefly adjusted his route direction at an upcoming intersection, maintaining situational awareness consistent with standard patrol protocol, while Officers Mills and Carter followed in synchronized movement, ensuring coverage of assigned sectors without deviation or reference to prior events. The resolved case remained present only within institutional records, fully categorized as a completed identity correction resulting from jurisdictional verification alignment between local enforcement interpretation and federal judicial confirmation systems. No further communication was transmitted regarding the incident, and no additional procedural review was initiated, confirming full closure across all operational channels. The environment around both the officers and Judge Cole remained stable and unchanged, with no residual indicators of the earlier procedural conflict visible within the physical city space. The entire sequence had transitioned from active enforcement misinterpretation to verified correction and final closure, leaving behind only standard urban continuity and the routine flow of daily life within the metropolitan system. The city had fully stabilized into normal operational continuity following the complete closure of the federal judicial identity verification incident, with all enforcement actions terminated, all procedural records finalized, and all participating units returned to standard duty assignments across their respective districts. Officer Ryan Blake, along with Officers Ethan Mills and Noah Carter, continued their routine patrol movement through the urban grid, maintaining standard spacing, awareness, and procedural discipline as they progressed through areas unrelated to the resolved event. Their posture and behavior reflected full reintegration into routine enforcement operations, with no remaining procedural engagement or reference to the earlier jurisdictional correction case. The radio system remained inactive regarding the prior incident, confirming that all transmissions had been archived and the case officially closed within both departmental and federal record systems. Across the city, Judge Madison Cole continued her independent movement through downtown streets, fully restored to uninterrupted status within the urban environment, her presence no longer associated with enforcement scrutiny or verification procedures, and now functioning solely within normal civilian movement patterns. The morning light had fully settled across the cityscape, illuminating intersections, buildings, and pedestrian pathways with consistent clarity, reinforcing the complete normalization of urban activity following the resolved procedural event. Traffic flowed steadily through intersections, pedestrians crossed streets without hesitation, and the city maintained its uninterrupted rhythm of daily function without awareness of the earlier jurisdictional correction that had briefly altered enforcement operations at a single fence perimeter location. Officer Blake made a minor directional adjustment at an upcoming intersection while maintaining standard patrol awareness. His focus fully returned to routine operational responsibilities and environmental monitoring. Officers Mills and Carter followed in coordinated formation, continuing their assigned sector coverage without deviation or reference to prior events, reflecting full procedural disengagement from the completed case. Judge Cole proceeded through a central district corridor, her movement steady and composed, blending seamlessly into the surrounding urban flow, with no remaining indicators of her earlier procedural involvement visible within the physical environment. The entire sequence that had once centered on misidentification, jurisdictional uncertainty, and federal verification override now existed solely as a closed institutional record, fully resolved within official systems and no longer present in active operational conditions. No further communication was transmitted, no additional review was initiated, and no residual procedural flags remained active within enforcement or federal coordination channels. The scene had transitioned completely from active institutional correction to full urban normalization, where all involved parties had returned to their respective roles within the city's continuous operational structure, leaving behind only documented confirmation of a completed judicial identity verification and authority realignment process.